and welcome to the June 27th, 2024 meeting of the Fiscal Management Committee. We squeaked one more in before the end of the fiscal year because it's been quite a year. My name is Lynn Harris. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the chair of the committee, and I will turn it over to my colleagues for introductions.
Good afternoon, Rebecca Smondrowski, District 2.
And joining us virtually.
Good morning, everyone. Julie Yang, District 3. Good to see everyone virtually.
And looking to my left, to our staff who are here.
Shannon Pattyfoot.
James Lipinski. Tom Lockman. Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, getting started. First item on our agenda, looking to my colleagues, any questions, comments, edits to the informational summary from our March 20th meeting? Okay, then that is adopted. Moving on to our next item, item 3.1, Capital Improvements Program. I see Mr. Adams coming up to join us. I find this format. I preferred our old, more intimate boardroom to this one. I feel like you're very far away.
Indeed.
Okay, so, and I'm going to let our two colleagues at the table introduce themselves before we get started.
Yvonne Alfonso Windsor, Acting Chief Financial Officer. Thank you.
And Seth Adams, Associate Superintendent for Facilities Management.
Okay.
So we'll just do a quick update on the CIP. Obviously, that is on the same timeline as our operating budget. I think there's obviously been a lot of focus on the operating budget. It's gone through its passage, but CIP was also passed at the same time by County Council. CIP represents $1.8 billion in this round, which is almost $150 million less than what the board requested. This particular CIP was pretty significant in terms of changes as it went through Education and Culture Committee to the full council. Some of those changes really were focused on removing some of our large major capital projects, the large individual projects, and focusing funding on system-wide initiatives, things like HVAC, roofing programs, our BIMP program, which is our building modification that goes in and makes changes for programmatic improvements. So for us, as that change is made, we will obviously be going into this coming CIP with a lot of changes related to how we report, how we show what those projects will look like. Again, the difference being, for this summer, those smaller projects that you don't necessarily always hear about because they're not as visible as a large new school like in Neillsville or Woodward, but we do about 300 to 400 of those projects a summer. And then obviously we will start to look at how do we do some of these projects throughout the school year, is that being one of the shifts from council. So things like we will map out, will we add relocatable classrooms while we do things like HVAC replacements in different wings and those types of things. As more money comes in, we cannot do everything over the summer months, so we're going to have to look at a different methodology of how we do this work and how we do it during the school year. So that is going to be a pretty fundamental change in our overall CIP. I do think it's something that is a good thing. It's a good thing because we do need to focus on that aging infrastructure. Every year we do the aging infrastructure report that goes to the county, and that's accompanied by the roads, transportation, obviously, DGS, other functions. And our backlog of aging infrastructure has just been continually growing over the past several years coming out of the pandemic. Inflation has obviously had an impact on that. We cannot do as much as we were able to do with the same amount of money. So as that's growing, the shift in funding more money in those systemics, obviously we will start to show what that looks like and how we're going to catch back up on that backlog information. But beyond that, I think what's really important is that for the CIP, obviously there were some significant delays. There were projects that were pulled completely out of the CIP. So as we go into this summer, we are going to be very intentional about how we communicate those changes. The last thing we want to do is have anyone surprised around where their project went. why it's not in the CIP at this time, and then just be very clear about how the process works and how they can advocate in the future if those projects are important for them to return to the CIP. So I do think you will likely see this fall a different recommendation from the superintendent, one that's more aligned with what the council adopted last year. So we may not be emphasizing, again, some of those larger projects. They may be out a little bit further, and we'll talk about, again, how we're going to manage those facilities between now and when they ultimately do need to be replaced. So that's just an update. Again, it is pretty significant. I think the communication that we have with our communities and our stakeholders between now and the fall is going to be really important. Again, I think the board usually hears, why did you take these projects out? The board did not, obviously. The board made clear recommendations and requests, and the funding was not there to fund all of it. So we will be very clear about what is in and what is out, and then how they can advocate moving forward. So that's really the update we have on the CIP. I do think, as these projects, as we start to identify what these projects are, I think we'll have more opportunities to talk with different communities about, what it looks like to go from maybe a full building to something that's scaled back to everything from HVAC to indoor air quality to paint to casework to finishes. Really just this refresh of buildings along the way, which I think is going to be pretty impactful to a lot of communities and a lot of schools. So that's our update. I guess I'll turn it back over to Ms. Harris if there's any questions by the committee.
Thank you, and I will turn first to my colleagues.
No, I'm good. I really appreciate your perspective on the communication being very important, because people don't know what we're doing or why we're doing it frequently. Even the council, even though we might put it in front of them, need to sometimes be reminded that this is how we got to here. So thank you for that.
And Ms. Yang.
No comment, but thank you for your work.
And I did just have a couple of questions. First, can you just remind us that we did approach the council's request for non-recommended reductions differently this year? And I think that was appreciated by the council, and I think it was made that process much more clear. If you would just give us a good little overview.
Sure. So the process this year, as the board made the request, goes through the county executive. The county executive put together a budget that required significant changes in terms of non-recommended reductions. So this year, we actually, instead of giving just one recommendation, we provided the Education and Culture Committee with two options. One option being traditionally how we achieved some of the budget shortfall and closing the gap on some of those budgetary issues, being small delays. You move this project 1 year, you move that project a year or two. And the second option was, again, pulling large projects out and focusing on the infrastructure. And really the reason being is that I think you've heard this term, I've heard it over the past 17 years a million times, this front-loaded CIP, this idea that all our projects are in the first 2 years of the CIP. That's correct to some extent, right? Because our construction, once you get to that point, the construction happens in those first 2 years, you open it and you move on. So what we did is shift more money in the out years, in those systemic projects. So it does level, the second approach leveled the CIP so that you don't have huge spikes in expenditures from the first 2 years to the year 3, 4, 5, 6 from there. So it was a change. It was something that we've been hearing from both council and the county executive desire to look at something that's more consistent, more, I guess in their terms, stable. But for us, I think it's still going to have some ebbs and flows because we are going to have projects that need to go in. This doesn't mean we're not going to have new projects. We're not going to have new buildings. But when they go in, obviously they'll fit with less of the inconsistencies from year to year around what those expenditure levels look like.
Thank you. And could you just talk a little bit about, so for years, and, full disclosure, I have a very long history with Montgomery County Council of PTAs. And I know this year, kind of the partnership with MCCPTA involved the creation of what they are, when we're looking at construction projects, from great big, very disruptive ones like the Northwood to Woodward, what we're looking at starting this fall for the next 3 years to additions, but what they're calling the skits, the school construction, I keep forgetting what the I is, impact teams, where it's an ongoing, collaboration, connection between the community and MCPS as those projects move forward. Could you just talk a little bit about those school construction impact teams, how they are being operationalized? Because I do believe this was the first academic year in which that approach has been used.
Sure, and that was a great partnership. We've been actually meeting with MCCPTA since the pandemic to this point, through everything from indoor air quality concerns to just impacts on students. This year we did focus on how do we communicate more clearly the work and the impact that's happening because of our capital improvements program. So one thing that we discovered was that we have a lot of meetings, right? From MCPS perspective, we have virtual meetings, we have community meetings, we do a lot of meetings, but one of the things that was very evident is that even though there was a lot of meetings, the information was not getting to everyone. And so this idea that, the parents and families can communicate with one another, they can sort of form more of a parent group, which is led by parents that are in these schools. They can talk about the impacts to everything around drop off to pick up to, what materials are going on or what noises may you hear. Just things that maybe are more impactful to individual families than larger communities. So the team started to meet. We provide everything around indoor air quality to construction schedules to impacts, and that information is then communicated out a little differently, or at least parallel to what we're continuing to do from our community meetings as well. So it's really, I think it's been very helpful. I think it's been very valuable, and hopefully we continue this collaboration moving forward, because it's been a really positive impact, I think, to these communities where they've been created this winter, spring, and this summer.
Yeah, and I've heard good things from the folks that have been your partners in that. And one other, so while we have Ms. Alfonso Windsor at the table, and we've talked about this, it feels like 100 times in the past 2-3 years, but into the pandemic, it sort of like blew our capital budget up with the inflationary pressures, supply chain disruptions, labor cost increases, everything from the length of time it takes now to complete a project because of those factors. Are the contractor community that would typically build on our projects now being unwilling to bid a project on a timeline that would have been typical and normal pre-pandemic. Now they just won't even bid on a project of scale for a 2-year time frame. So that's our right now reality, which we're addressing and dealing with. Looking at, our cost increases, it's in some projects almost 30% more than we projected when we put these into the queue. Are we seeing anything that's going to indicate any of those pressures, the inflationary pressures, supply chain disruptions, labor costs, are going to ameliorate or at least level out?
I'm not seeing anything. I mean, I know on the operating side as well, we're seeing those impacts. We keep adding or trying to fund those inflationary factors. And last year, we hoped that they would level off. We were at 20% last year. We were still similar this year. So we're not seeing that changing right now.
The one thing we are tracking, though, is the private construction community is leveling off. There's a lot of projects that have either been put on hold or have stalled out because of financing and other reasons that are associated with these projects. So we are tracking that, and that work has leveled out, and we're actually seeing more contractors bid our work. There's a project out right now, Joanne Lullock. We have more contractors than we've had in years that are looking at these projects now. So at least on the construction side, we're not necessarily seeing materials that are going down, but at least we're seeing more competition than what we were seeing previously when both the private and the public sector were building at equal rates. So not great for the private side, but at least hopefully we'll benefit from the added competition and the more involvement in our projects.
Okay, and one project I did want to just mention briefly. We have a construction project ongoing through the summer and into next year at Greencastle Elementary. And I know, I've heard from the community, heard from the staff, heard from the skit that's working at that community about what we're doing to ensure there's some unique, I think, concerns about an on-site project there during the school year with some of the behavioral challenges that they've experienced this year. And so can you just talk a little bit about how we are working, particularly with the contractors that are doing that work, to really double down on safety, since some of that work will be happening on site while there are kids in the building?
Sure, and that is one that's obviously every project we go into it from the safety first perspective. Greencastle, though, what I would say is that it's a repeat school of others. So we have anything from Goshen to McNair to Waters Landing. We just finished the McNair edition, which is almost identical to what we're doing at Greencastle. So we learned a lot in terms of what are the impacts to the existing building, what are the impacts around drop off and pickup. So we're going to take obviously those lessons learned from McNair into the Greencastle project. But I do think with a new principal that's coming in this summer, this has been sort of a little bit of a challenge for us because you build out a plan with administration. When you have new administration, they may have different ideas of how they arrange the building, how they arrange classes. So we're sort of going in lightning speed here to catch up in terms of how are you looking to arrange your building, how are you looking to operate the building, and then how can we partner with you to make sure we minimize impacts. But you are correct from a communications standpoint. That is a very tight site. The walkers, the pedestrian, the buses. It's going to be a very close dance as we go through this fall, as we go to the start of the school year, to make sure everyone is safe, everyone's following the rules around where they can be, where they shouldn't be, those sorts of things. But this project also includes some roadway pedestrian safety. So I know we're really working with DOT on the timing of that and how do we again implement that in the safest possible way. But yes, the skit is definitely going to help us in this case, so we can communicate in multiple languages to families again that typically may not come to our community meetings.
Yeah, and I know I'm glad you mentioned the impact, the transportation piece and the impacts on site access because of the project, whether you're a walker or you ride a bus or get there some other way, because these are our littlest learners who don't always, think before they act. And so we are looking very, very closely at just the kind of the pedestrian safety around that site while this project is moving forward. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. Thank you to both of you. I think we're moving on next to our next agenda item is the operating budget, our FY25 operating budget. My, that was fun.
Good morning, Ms. Harris and members of the board. I think Ms. Ella Bradley, Director of the Department of Human Capital, is joining us, and so is Ms. Diane Gomez. She's the supervisor for the school finance and operations team, as well as Mr. Rob Riley, Associate Superintendent of Finance. So as you all know, there have been several discussions on the operating budget. The final operating budget that was appropriated by the County Council and adopted by the board was $3.3 million. It was $30.5 million less than was requested by the board back in February. We had several challenges this year, as you all know, with the ending of the federal funding. So very difficult decisions had to be made. In spite of those decisions, we were able, though, to move forward and fund the negotiated agreements for our employees that are effective this July. And we were able to bring the mental health supports, curriculum funding, the psychologists, the PCCs from ESSER and move those into the operating budget. So all of those supports are going to remain for our students for next year. There were some difficult decisions that had to be made as a result of the $30 million reduction. And some of those difficult decisions were the increase in class sizes and the reduction of our staff development teachers, the defer or delay of the expansion of the pre-kindergarten program, among others. We did have central office reductions that impacted, our staff and the closure of the virtual academy, as well as some contractual services that had to be reduced. But now, moving forward, we need to know we're moving into the implementation aspect of this budget. Effective July 1, we will begin spending the budget. The impacts that we're now feeling and that everybody, has been aware of is the staffing, right? Because that takes place before July 1. We have to start planning and start moving forward before July 1. So Ms. Diane Gomez is going to talk about what that increasing class size represents, put some context around, what that will mean for our schools. And then Ms. Bradley is going to talk about, the staffing at our schools and where we are at that point. Go ahead.
Good morning. So I wanted to I wondered if you are aware of just what the class sizes were and where they're going. So I just want to touch on that briefly. So I'll give an example at the secondary level. Required English classes, and what I mean by that are classes that they need to graduate, credit classes, not the elective English classes. The class size guideline was 29, and that is going to 30 for next school year. And then all other classes at the secondary level, the class size guideline was 32, and they're going to 33. This does not mean that every class that sits in a secondary school is around that number. When I just ran some preliminary numbers to kind of compare where we were sitting this year with actual enrollment and then into next year with actual enrollment, keeping in mind that the actual enrollment includes all of our discrete services students, our early college students who are not sitting in classes. So this actually the class size average would be even lower had we taken those students out. And an example at the middle school level is that this current year, average class sizes are about 26.3. Again, this is with all students, so we're not pulling out any that are not sitting in seats in our general ed classes. And for next year, it would be at about 27.4 if we're using actual students in building, in Synergy right now. Again, I think it's going to be a little bit lower than this because I'm using all students right now. At the elementary level, we have so many different class sizes depending on the type of school, depending on the grade level. I'll use an example for our Title I focus schools. The class size guidelines for K to 2 are 18 currently for this school year. Next school year, it'll be 19. To give an example of impact, we have schools obviously where we did a lot of reductions on June 3rd, where there was an impact where we did have to reduce the teacher allocation. But I wanted to give an example of a focus school where if I have 75 students in grade 1, and that class size guideline for this year is currently 18 students, and that's what we built the budget on to begin with, the 75 students would be 4 sections. So you'd have a class size of 18 and 3 class sizes of 19, and that would have been in our current class size guideline. When we look to next year, if we're increasing the guideline to 19, there's no change to that grade level to that school because class sizes of 18, 19, 19, and 19 still fit within the guidelines for that school. If we would take a teacher or, reduce by one, the class sizes would be well over 19, and we don't want that to happen. So that's an example of where, I would say the class size guidelines are increasing by one are impacting every school in some way, but it's not the impact that we're reducing teachers at every school. It would be basically a situation where, also the impact can be the other way. If a school would have been eligible for a teacher under our old class size guidelines, they may not be eligible anymore because we're increasing by one. So there are a lot of different factors with the class size guidelines. And I do want to mention, Ms. Alfonso Windsor did mention the staff development teacher reduction. That is not happening at the elementary level. All elementary schools will have the full staff development teacher full-time. At the secondary level, it's decreasing, as you know, from a 1.0 to a 0.6 FTE. That also does impact some summer planning hours as well, because we prorate those depending on the FTE of the assignment. And so I wondered if I can pass it to Ella, or we can have some questions regarding class size guidelines, whichever you want to do.
Yeah, why don't we stop now and see if my colleagues have any questions, and then we'll continue. So I'll turn first.
Okay.
And Ms. Yang?
Thank you so much for that update. I'm actually now at Seattle, attending a women's conference, and I had an opportunity to connect back with some educators, colleagues that work for the Seattle Public Schools. They also have a stiff budget shortfall this year and increased class sizes. So as all over the country, as we deal with the asset cliff and the economic situation, many school systems are experiencing the same thing. Now, my question is, have the schools that have class size changes or have our schools communicated with our families, especially in elementary school levels, but of course, secondary levels, to our families?
The class size guidelines are communicated by Ms. Gomez and the Office of School Support and Wellbeing, or Office of School Support and Improvement moving forward. The directors and associate superintendents are aware when any reductions in staffing or with any class size information, and they make sure that they communicate it with the principal, that they touch with base with the principal, and then the principal would be communicated that information to our families. So the principals at the schools, since he knows they know their communities, they're familiar with the needs of their communities. They're the ones that eventually determine, how the staff is applied at the school. They are the ones that are making those communications with our communities and staff.
I do see communication, especially from the local principals and teachers, and how they will, support students, will provide tremendous help and assurance, right, for our families. This is not ideal, but we will find a way to support and meet the needs of our students. Thank you.
Yeah, and I did have a question. So I have had some recent conversations with some elementary school principals, and many of them were telling me that their kindergarten enrollment for next year, at least as of early June, was significantly less than they had been expecting, and some of them were positing some of that may relate to our the way we changed this year our kindergarten orientation processes and stopped having the day where we would that kindergartners wouldn't be in school, but the school would welcome in the incoming class, and so they were positing that could have been part of the issue. But how are we staffing around elementary schools who are seeing, at least as of early June, and you did mention, Ms. Gomez, schools were getting staffing changes as late as June 3, which is very late. And when they were, seeing maybe, and some elementary principals were saying they were seeing less than half of what they were expecting as of that date. So how are we monitoring that and monitoring that through summer? Because we do know, especially in the earliest grades, families come in throughout the summer. All of our schools are open all summer long, and they're coming in to the main office to enroll. And how are we monitoring those trends and looking at staffing if we do see relatively dramatic changes over the summer?
So in my office, I look at the actual enrollment every week, and I'm running reports and sending them to folks. And I actually separate out kindergarten because I don't want to skew the other, I don't want to skew elementary as a whole. So we're seeing, this past week, we increased by about 300 kindergartners from 2 weeks ago. The time before, it was about 184 that we increased. And so the thing that helps us is obviously we start with projected enrollment. But I also keep historical kindergarten official enrollment. I've kept that since I started in the position about 2000, I think it was the FY17. So I have that data where we can look at an average of the official enrollment over time, because there are some schools that when I probably first started in this job, I was saying we need to reduce at this school, and over time we see that every year kids are coming in and enrolling, or families are coming in and enrolling their kindergartners in August and sometimes into September. And so we have that historical data of the schools, and we always ask that principals, even if they're new to the building, that they're asking for that historical data, because they will know, okay, I usually have 40 students enroll over the summer, things like that, that it's helpful for us to have. I have had principals reach out to me just recently saying, for instance, I have 3 sections of kindergarten. I only have 35 students enrolled right now. I'm a non-focused school. I need you to reduce my kindergarten right now. So we do have some very proactive principals that are looking at their numbers daily as well and making those decisions. And then they know that if it increases, that they would just, put in a request for an additional teacher, and it might be later in the year. And I think they're just trying to make those decisions for impacted employees so that we aren't doing it in August or during pre-service where we're having to reduce at that time.
And I guess a question I would have is what about the flip? So if we do see a school where their current enrollment is below projections and it simmers there through July and into early August, but then all of a sudden everybody starts to pay attention or gets back from vacation and scuttles into their elementary school and enrolls their students, and they see a big uptick in late August. And so maybe they had been looking at, well, it looks like we're only going to have 3 kindergarten sections this year. All of a sudden, I just had 25 more students enroll. How will we handle that? Because those would be late changes.
Right. We do keep reserve in our classroom teacher allocation. So we would be able to accommodate that school by giving them another classroom teacher. As far as the staffing of that, that's where I would need Ella to help with that piece, because she would know what's available as far as staffing. Not that I don't care about people, but I'm very focused on the numbers, and then I think about the people behind that as we're making decisions.
Okay. And then just another question, and this may be for later, but you did sort of mention, Ms. Alfonso-Windsor, that we'd already sort of done the work with the associations around contract salaries for the coming year. And I know one of the issues that we were discussing earlier in this fiscal year was looking at our salary schedules, which had been not really examined for quite some time. And there was a determination, I believe, that it was time to take a look at our salary schedules. And the interest was, I think we were initially looking to get some outside expertise to help us in setting those, because when you are looking to set salary schedules, what you're basically looking to make a change that is going to be impacting basically a generation of teachers and staff members. And I think in the final analysis, we did not do that. And so, I mean, I personally have some concern about that, but if you could just address that issue.
Thank you. So yes, we are looking right now at the MCEA salary schedule redesign. And actually, everyone sitting at this table is part of that work group. We've been meeting with the associations. So we're in the process of looking at doing the work. We have benchmarked with some of the other area LEAs, not only in Maryland, but across the country. And hopefully, a decision, will come to a decision, later this year on how that redesign will look.
Okay.
But we are doing that work. So it was not the contractual piece. That's not how we're moving forward. We're doing the work as MCPS employees and associations working as a team to determine how we're going to be moving forward.
Okay, so we are not simply taking something that was given to us. We are actually doing our own objective analysis. Okay, that was my concern, because that was sort of not the information that was coming down to us. Okay, I think that's my questions for this section. So I will turn it back to you all.
Thank you. So I will turn it over to Ella Bradley so that she can give us some updates on staffing, if that's okay.
So once the reductions have been made in terms of our educators, then we are the ones who now take the baton and support those educators to find a new home. We have them on our priority placement list. And then, of course, because of the closing of MVA and there were impacted employees because of the class increase, there were more individuals in a second round of surplus teachers on our priority placement list. So the team meets every day to review any new vacancies that may appear. We look at, we gave the teachers an opportunity to fill out a preference form so that we have an idea of maybe their home address is here, but they drop off their children at another location. And so they're interested, or perhaps they are working towards a new certification and they would be interested in working in a different content area. So that is one of the things that we look at when we're looking to place individuals and helping them find a new home. So out of the individuals who have been placed on the priority placement list, I'm happy to say that we are 91% placed individuals. So we still have about 70 individuals that we are looking for a home for them. 35 of them are classroom teachers, and the others are the teachers that got impacted by the PE, art, and music. And so I keep those numbers separate because that area is a little bit different in terms of how we approach it, because there are usually spread across multiple schools. So we really have to look at the scheduling and the allocation for each school and which schools we can match together so that the educator has a schedule and are made whole with a 1.0.
Just a quick clarifying question. So mostly when you're talking about PE, art, and music, you're talking about in the elementary grades?
Yes, those were the ones that were mostly impacted by the reduction.
Okay.
We have about 11 teachers from the MBA that still need to find a home. Out of all of them, those are mostly in English, social studies, and one SLP and a PE teacher. So we're making great progress with that. We recognize that it's still those 11 people, and the 70 that I mentioned, they're still in flux. They're still trying to find where they're going to be, because having an idea of where you want to be, where you're going to be, and then being told so late does make an impact. So we are, like I mentioned, we meet every day so that we can try to do it as quickly as possible, because the contract does allow individuals to self-secure in their own position by July 20th. So we want to try to do it as quickly as possible to allow people to still have that opportunity.
Could you
Clarify that?
Yes.
Okay.
Non-edu speak there. Yeah.
If you were on my priority placement list and you are a science teacher and you came from school A and I placed you in school B, and I've placed everyone in the content area of science, so I no longer have anyone who is a science teacher who needs to find a home. Then, per the contract, I'm allowed to what we call open that content area. So individuals in MCPS who are science teachers or who perhaps just received their science degree and they want to, or their certification and they want to teach science, they have the opportunity to apply to a science position as they become available and are interested. They have the opportunity to apply, be interviewed by the principal, and if selected, they can transfer to that school. So we want to have people have choice. And this process did not allow our educators and did not allow our administrators to have much choice. And so the faster we can do it, and in working with our schools and their directors, we're trying to do this as quickly as possible so that we have the greatest amount of time for choice for our administrators and for our educators.
Ms. Yang has her hand raised.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Bradley. Thank you so much for the update. I first want to thank you and your office for your hard work. I understand with the budget impact, the workload for your office has increased significantly this year. I'm glad to hear 91% of these involuntary transfer are already placed. We still have 70 individuals to be placed. Can you also talk a little bit about the vacancies that our system currently have for teaching positions?
Sure. So as the vacancies come, we are scooping them up as quickly as possible so that we can place our individuals in there. We still have some vacancies for special ed. And we have about 40 vacancies in elementary, but because we've placed all of our individuals who were on the priority placement list in elementary, we've now opened elementary for our open contracts. So we had offered open contracts to individuals, and they agreed that they wanted to work for MCPS. And so now our principals who have vacancies have the opportunity to self-select someone off of the open contract list. If and when that is completed, then we would open for external hiring, meaning that anyone outside of the system who's currently not have a signed contract with us, we would be open for external hire.
So as far as the special education, so we have special ed openings and some elementary openings. How many of the open contracts do we currently still have? Because I understand with this change, some of them might withdraw from our list. How many remain on our list of open contracts?
So right now, we just sent our open contracts an email earlier this week, letting them know exactly where we stand as a district, letting them know that we will continue to honor our contract with them, and just letting them know that if they have changed their mind, we would, of course, release them from the contract, and it would not be a negative mark on their record, and they would, of course, always be welcome to apply again with MCPS. So once we have that data, I'll have a better understanding of how many people we're working with, because we gave them a couple of days to fill that out.
Thank you. Thank you for the update. I think this is important work for us as the employer in the industry. The more we communicate, explain, and follow up, the better for us for our future work. Thank you.
Agreed.
I just have one follow-up question. You mentioned about if there's a position becomes open, principals can pick people to come in to fill those positions. Did I misunderstand that?
So it depends. It's by content. We have a whole list of all of the contents listed, and we refer to it as our open and closed list. Basically, it allows our principals to know in which content area can they expect a placement, and in which content area could they perhaps pick an open contract, and then eventually, if they can interview and hire someone who's an external candidate. So it's dependent on the content because of the contract language saying that we need to place our priority placement teachers first.
So the reason I'm asking is because do the principals then, do those people have to re-interview, I guess is what I'm trying to spit out, for those jobs?
Which people?
The people that are waiting for a job with open contracts, if a school principal has an opening, can they just pick somebody, or do they have to go through that whole interview process and community panel? I don't know what's involved fully.
Right. So in order to receive an open contract, my team does the vetting in terms of looking, of course, at your references, looking at your school program. Are you on track to be certified, whether you're coming from out of state, whether you're graduating? And they are the ones who do that preliminary interview to indicate that this is a strong candidate and someone that we want to secure under contract. They are then placed in, say, like a folder, their application. You as an administrator, you have the choice. As you are looking through, you might be looking for someone, if you're an elementary teacher, you might be looking for someone who has a math focus. While our elementary teachers, teach all the subjects, you might want someone who's really focused on math because it supports your goals for your school. And so as they are looking through those individuals, they might call their staffer and say, I'm really looking for someone who has this background, and they support them to narrow that down. Most of our principals do want to have a conversation with a person so that way they can see and explain and also sell their school to the open contract as well.
Yeah, and see if there's a nice connection or whatever. The reason I was asking is because we've heard complaints in the past about principals picking somebody that they know that they'd like to work with for a position and not making it an application type of thing. And so I just didn't know. To me, if you know your school, you should be able to pick what you need. And but I just wasn't sure how that all works in terms of our contracts. So thank you.
Thank you for all of this. And I do think that we've been going through a tough time in MCPS, and one of the things I think we really need to get better at as a system is how we treat people, because I think how we treat people matters, and how we treat people relates very directly to our reputation in the wider world and whether people actually want to come and be part of us. And so I hope we're really focusing on, especially in human resources, which is this has been a tough time for you all, is that when we have employees that are going through things that are hard, we can't change the fact that they're going through something that's hard, but we can intentionally not make it worse by treating them with kindness and with humanity. And I hope that is something that we are really very much focusing on. And, sort of that, put ourselves in their shoes as they're walking through that process, because really and truly how we treat people does matter. And I think sometimes in the past several years, we have not always treated people well. And that needs to be something that we get better at. But I do have a question. And I'm going to give a shout out here to a group of student advocates who reached out to me from Paint Branch High School, who were concerned because their instrumental music teacher position had been cut from an FTE to a 0.6. And so the individual who held that position moved on, and they're having a very hard time filling that position. And I just want to put this out there into the ether that as we are, the FY26 budget cycle starts on July 1st. And I do think that I have an interest in looking at particularly our arts educators in our secondary schools as a true equity issue in our school system, because I think it is not equitable that we have some high schools that have multiple full-time instrumental music, arts, and choral teachers, and other schools who do not have at least one full-time person in those roles. And to me, it is an equity issue. Every secondary school should have a full-time instrumental music teacher, choral music teacher. And if the enrollment, we say enrollment drives instruction, if the enrollment in the classes that those individuals would be teaching is dipping, then part of their work is to build the demand. But it is not, I think, this is just me speaking for myself, it is not in the best interest of the system for us to say, well, we're just going to reduce that because the demand for that instrumental music, that choral music isn't there, because that is inequitable. And so anyway, just putting that out there that I will be looking and advocating for us to look differently at how we staff the arts, certain positions in our secondary schools moving forward to correct some of those equity issues that I see. And I did also want to ask a question that goes to our process for hiring, especially in special programs and specialty areas. One of the things I want to make sure when we are doing the initial screening interviews for people with that in those specialty areas like instrumental music, are we ensuring that some of our content experts in those areas are participating in the screening, or is that something that is not happening right now?
So what happens is an individual who's interested in that position can put in their application. One of my staffing coordinators would review their application to see if they meet the minimum qualifications to be eligible to be a teacher. So we're right now at that stage, we're looking, do you meet the requirements that is set forth by MSDE? And so if you are, then you are accepted to be in let's say, I'm missing on the word right now, but you're placed in the folder. And so our individuals the coordinators who oversee the music and the PE and the arts, they have access to that folder. And so they can go in there and they are then have the opportunity to really look through those individuals, meet with them, talk to them, do another level of interview, because then they can use that information to support our schools, because a lot of times they also know our schools and where the program is in terms of, oh, I really need an experienced person here, or I really want someone who is a brand new teacher because they're going to be bringing some new ideas from what they've learned in their university. And so then they can reach and help to facilitate some of those things with the administrators that they know that they have. I know you're going to have a retirement. You're going to have this vacancy. I just met someone and interviewed this person, and I think that that's the person that, would be a good fit for you. Obviously, those vacancies have to survive our priority placement because ultimately we owe our current employees a best fit. But the coordinators do work with the department, and they have access to those individuals as well. So.
Okay, thank you. Because one of the issues that I've become aware of recently in looking at, especially talking with some of our student advocates who really have deep interest in ensuring equitable access to particularly instrumental music, and really, from the perspective of someone who as a student did have great access, great instruction, and have a passion for instrumental music, and want to make sure that other students have the same opportunities that they did. And in doing a little bit of a dive, one of the things that I learned was that in elementary instrumental music, students are supposed to, in all of our elementary schools, be able to choose from at least 10 instruments when they get to that age in grade 4. But I know that in fact is not happening. And some students in some elementary schools get access to choosing even more. They have choice of even more than the 10 base instruments that we say, and others don't. They have far less choice. And also, suppose it is we are supposed to be providing strings in all of our elementary schools, and I know that is something certainly that is not happening. And so that's a question sort of for another day, but I do think that gets to, are we doing what we say we're doing? And how do we make sure we have the staffing expertise to actually deliver the instruction that we say we are delivering? Because again, that is an equity issue. It shouldn't matter what elementary school you go to. If we say every student in elementary school can begin strings in elementary school, that needs to be true. And it currently is not true. And so that is just another issue that I think we need to start looking at more directly, which does get to, I think, and it may be, as you've mentioned, the screening interview just looks at, does this teacher meet the MSDE qualifications to do this, to serve in this capacity? And maybe we need to look more directly at what MSDE is saying those qualifications need to be as that relates to what we say our instructional program is, and ensuring there is truly alignment there. Because I think some of what I'm understanding is sometimes not all instrumental music teachers, especially at the elementary level, have the same background and expertise, and so that can influence what opportunities are available to students. And so, anyway, something for another day. But again, just looking at if we can't keep talking about equity if we aren't really looking at it in everything that we do, and if we aren't willing to look to really drill down school to school to school and see is there equity of opportunity whichever school you sit in. And to me, that is just part of the bigger, wider work. But anyway, so any other questions from my colleagues? Okay, next thing.
Thank you. So the next item is the planning for the fiscal year FY 2026 operating budget process. And we're getting ready to kick that off. We're just finalizing, although we've had all these conversations about the FY 2025, we are finalizing the documents as we speak. And we're hoping to have the book published online next week, and then the hard copies are going to go out. And we're kicking off the FY 26 process as well, finalizing, also closing the FY 24 year, which we're working on as well. The FY 26 is going to be challenging, but we're up to the challenge. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Riley to walk us through the presentation on those challenges.
Thanks, Ms. Alfonso-Windsor. And challenging is a good word. If FY25 was a challenging budget, this is going to be much of the same. I wanted to bring us back about a year ago today, Ms. Harris. In the first meeting of the Fiscal Management Committee meeting, you kind of proposed a theme of making every dollar count. And I think it's even more appropriate as we go from this year to next year, especially last year we were saying it because we were operating without a fund balance. We were hitting the FSR cliff, but even more now so in the face of inflation. And then just the stark reality that we do have a limited amount of resources that we really do have to make every dollar count. So next slide, please. So here's some of the issues as we go through this FY26 budget process. And as the board mentioned 2 weeks ago, we really started that, we kind of started a month or so ago, looking at this, some of the issues that are facing. We've started developing our calendar. But the first item we wanted to mention too was funding the financial deficit in the employee benefit plan. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I just wanted to clarify, the board did put an investment of $40 million in the FY25 budget. Basically what that's going to cover is the inflationary aspect or the rate change aspect for next year. If you recall, to make this budget balanced, we had to do a variety of things. We had to do a freeze. We had to get additional money from the county to the tune of $10 million. So we're not out of the woods yet. The fund is not sustainable yet. So we're going to be looking for an additional increase in base budget funding to make that employee benefit plan sustainable going forward. Next area there is placeholder for the contracts for employee associations. So last year or the year before, we had 2-year agreements with our associations. So last year, at this point, we kind of knew what that amount was. This year, we're going back to how it was in the past. We're going to have to set a placeholder because that's going to be subject to negotiations, which we'll be going through. Resources for continued implementation of Blueprint for Maryland's, the Blueprint. So we did have to defer pre-K, as Ms. Alfonso Windsor mentioned in the beginning. That doesn't mean those requirements are going away. We deferred it, but we're going to still have to make attempts to keep improving on those pillars of the Blueprint. So those are going to be things that we're going to have to address in the budget as well, too. Next item, same services funding requirements. So with all the reductions that we've had in central office over the last 2 years, when we say same service funding requirements, it's a little bit of an ask. So right now what we do is, and I'll talk about this when we kind of go through the calendar. Once the budget year starts, we're going to be going to the offices and the directors and associates within the offices and say, look at the funding that you have now. What do you need from that funding to maintain the same services? And I think we've had discussions before at the board table and at this table that sometimes that's going to be a stretch to meet that same service. But we do, like Ms. Alfonso Windsor mentioned, it's going to be challenging, but we have to do that. So the way we do that is we dig deep, we look at every line item in our budget, and we kind of see, can some of those items be realigned to make sure that we can still meet same services? Multi-year budget estimates, that's another thing that we are going to be looking into. It came up during the discussion of our EBP. What does next year look like? I just mentioned it before. We're already looking at next year. So some of our other LEAs in the state, they do to some extent multi-year budget estimates. And it's not like the CIP where it's a 6-year outlook. Most of our counterparts, they're looking out like we would look at FY26 and then 27 and 28 during the development of the 26. In no way should it be construed that this is for planning purposes and folks should look at, hey, you promised us you do this in 28. It's really just to kind of set the stage of what our revenue estimates are and what potentially expenditures could look like. But it's really just an informational tool when we talk about multi-year budget estimates. And then finally, as we look towards FY26, we want to increase community trust, and that's going to be through enhanced engagement and collaboration. So this year, we increased the amount of Superintendent Budget Advisory Committee meetings. We increased the number of community forums, which were very beneficial. We had in person, we had online, but that's how we put to numbers the board's strategic plan and the board's priorities and gather input from our stakeholders. So we're looking to increase that as well, too, this year.
And if I may, I just want to emphasize when we're looking at same services funding requirements, yes, Mr. Riley is correct. We look line by line item. Our offices review their budgets. But when we're looking at same services, inflationary costs are part of that. Like we were discussing earlier about the capital budget, the costs keep increasing. So it might, providing the same services for FY26 might cost more than, of the cost right now. So that is an impact that we will have as well. And as Mr. Riley mentioned, we are continuing to troubleshoot and see how we can bring in the community and engage the community farther through our budget process to really understand where their priorities are and how we can recommend, meeting those priorities.
Next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk us through, nothing much changed. This is the calendar that we've been operating on for many, many years. But I just wanted to walk us through it just to get an idea of what's coming down the pike. So in July, we consider that the kickoff. We do an operating budget kickoff meeting where the folks that are going to be responsible for their same service budgets, we meet with them, we let them know the expectations. In certain areas, as we mentioned, they're looking at what can they do, looking at every line item in the budget to meet those same services. But they're also tasked with what can we do for enhancements? Is there something in the board's priorities that could be addressed with additional funding? Whether that's available or not is yet to be seen. But they're looking forward to see what can help that, what can help the mission of moving the dial on student achievement. For instance. And we're also looking at, when they're doing that, what are some things that we know are inflation coming down the pike or rate changes. That is something that is not covered by maintenance of effort. So we've been lucky. The county has been giving us more funding above maintenance of effort. But when we have these same services discussions, the departments have to figure and have to look at what's it going to cost us in the future, in this next upcoming fiscal year. So then once we do that, then there's a lot of work between August and December with the Superintendent's Budget Advisory Committee and working through internal looks at our budget per line item. This is when we're reaching out to the community and to our various stakeholders throughout the system. We're kind of in a waiting period because we don't know our funding. And that's one of the issues that we see as part of this process. On January 15th, that's when we have the governor releases his budget. So we have a good idea of what our state funding is going to be. But as you know, state funding is just a portion of our funding. We have to wait till May to get our county funding. But in the meantime, the board in January is meeting, once the superintendent's budget is put out, the board's going to have work sessions and hearings to get that public input. And as you can kind of see, as I've mentioned, January 15th is kind of right in the middle of that. So what's going to happen is during the first work session or hearing, we will know what that state funding is. We'll learn that, and then sometimes that'll provide information for the subsequent work sessions and hearings. But that's kind of where we're at with state funding. Then in December, superintendent's going to release the FY26 operating budget. And then that's when, there'll be further discussions with the board and with community stakeholders on, is what's in that budget, is that what you were expecting to see? We did community forums this year. The questions we asked was, hey, what's working on our budget? We asked 3 questions. What's not working? What can we reevaluate? And then what's something new we should consider to move that, to enhance everything that we're doing. So, and then finally, February 4th, that's on the calendar. That's when the board's going to tentatively adopt the operating budget for FY26. So a lot happens in that time frame, but that's kind of the brief description there.
And if I may just, this is our process. This is what we normally followed. There's different circumstances this year. You just appointed a new superintendent, Dr. Taylor, and we look forward to working with him because as we kick off, the budget for next year, we have to take into consideration, and we always do, the board priorities, but also the vision of our new superintendent, and how he will like to move forward. So we'll be working with him, before we communicate to the offices what the plan is.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's why I had my light on. I was going to say, how are we incorporating our new superintendent? Because I know he's, very heavily engaged in the financial aspects of his systems, and I look forward to him having an opportunity to really dive in and see what we're doing and where we might be going. But when we're talking about some of these plans, like how we're going to look to the future and everything, I just want to always keep trying to caution people right now as to, let's give him a chance to come in and to see if that's how he wants to move forward. So thank you for pointing that out.
No, and I just want to say we are very excited that he has the financial background.
Right.
Yes.
And this will be his superintendent's budget, so.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We're to discussion, so I will look to, I see Ms. Yang's hand.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the timeline. Now, the picture is a little bit not optimistic, right? It's going to be a tough budget year. So I have 2 requests to help me. I think it will also inform our colleagues as we go forward with this process. One thing, you mentioned the blueprint requirement. Can we have a timeline of blueprint requirements so that we can see, like, for the next 5 years, what in the blueprint is mandatory at the moment? I know that there might be legislatures to address different things at different times, but as of now, in the 5 years projecting, what are the definite requirement, deadline, hard deadline requirement of the blueprint? I think I will appreciate that, right? And then second thing is, I would like to take a look at our spending in the technology area to get a better idea. I understand technology, some of it come under our CIP, like our Chromebooks and equipment, but some of it come under our operating budget. So as a system for our operating budget side or the CIP side, do we have a 5-year projection of what is our cost of spending in this area, right? Licensing, software, many things. So I think one of the things is you mentioned these multi-year budget estimate. I think having these, I think maybe our strategy, maybe our prediction will help provide information for my work. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great example of why multi-year budgeting is going to help us for those two particular reasons. What is the technology spend over the next few years, and blueprint?
Yes, absolutely. And we also, the county council and the county executive requests from us every year for us to give them a 5-year projection. And we know it's just a projection because, you know, we've talked about inflationary costs. Those are hard to project. We do account for them, but we do projections for employee benefits plan, for our salaries, and it's just projections because things haven't been negotiated. But as we do that, we will be very happy to share that with you as well and work on this specific request that you submitted as well.
Right. And also, if I may add, if possible, Mr. Alfonso Windsor, if it's possible, can you please have line items, right? The technology spending. What are some items? If you say $80 million or $8 million on licensing or software, what are they? You know, and if we can have a little bit more detail, right? A blueprint projected. These are the deadline for what specific items, like pre-K to what number, covering testing for what number. So if we can have, you know, drill down a little bit to details, that will, I will appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that gets to something that I know many of you have heard me say since, I believe, February of 2021. Our public-facing documents around our procurements definitely need to be much more, they need to be more specific. And you know, as I think many of you have heard me say, and it doesn't have to be, it can just be a sentence or two, but we need to know, and the public needs to know, because it's their money, what we're buying with each contract that you put for us to raise our hands. And it's definitely been getting better, but I think we just need to make sure we can't talk about transparency and trust building. We need to be talking about being trustworthy, and that means being clear about what are we spending our money on. And it doesn't take that much to add a sentence into a procurement item. Instead of saying, you know, $400,000 for software, saying what specific software is it? $175,000 for furniture. What furniture? We can do that. It is within our capacity, and we, again, since February of 2021, we can do it. We just need to be consistent in making sure that we are sharing with the public where their money's going, and that, I think, will help. And that does get, and this might be backing up a bit, but it to FY25, but I think it maybe it's umbrella over both FY25 and 26, because this year's budget from the council it came with strings. And so can you just talk a little bit about what the county council specified the MCPS needed to do as far as sharing, information sharing, transparency going forward?
Yeah, you're right, and that was part of the resolution. So there's about 5 or 6. Some of them are reporting requirements, which in our case, it's kind of expanding some of the tables that we already provide in the budget document, but just a little more detail there. Others is looking at evaluation of programs is one of the items that was in there as well too. So things that we do, but maybe we don't make as transparent as what's requested from the county council. So These are areas, and as you mentioned, Ms. Harris, even just the public-facing documents around procurement, we have made enhancements, but we could still look at that to see how we can make it more user-friendly, which we'll talk about in our next topic as well, too.
Yes, good. And one of the things, so we've already talked about the fact that one of the things in the FY25 budget that was part of the reduction is we moderated our planned expansion of pre-K. And, pre-K is a huge priority for everybody everywhere because we know the benefits in the long run for our learners. And, but I think my colleagues have heard me say for many months now, one of my concerns is when we do have mandates from the blueprint and the AIB is looking at all Maryland's 24, LEAs, how each is meeting the blueprint requirements. But I'm wanting to understand at what level we are being given a command and at what level we can expand but right size it. I think my colleagues have heard me say this a lot this year, moving as we were working on the FY25 budget and then going into FY26, making sure we right size it to the actual needs and demands of our system. And so when we talk about pre-K expansion, and I was at what turned out to be a very long meeting yesterday with Maryland Association of Boards of Education, one of the things we were looking at is how in legislation this year, the General Assembly did moderate the, I guess you'd call it benchmarks that the blueprint had set for pre-K expansion and that partnership between public and private, because nobody was meeting the initial goal for, I think it was initially to have 30 or 40% of each LEA's pre-K seats provided by private providers. And nobody's getting there. And they moderated that, but they still have a long-term deadline. I think it's now into FY28 or maybe 29 of still 50% of those providers being in the private sector. And, that's ongoing work. And the state has to do a lot of things to make that goal even attainable. And that is well beyond MCPS. But how are we able to moderate our operating budget requests to be the right size for our needs versus what the blueprint is telling us we have to do?
Ms. Harris, I'm wondering if we should table that for the next committee meeting and include Janine Backey in that conversation as she's over blueprint?
Turn it over to you guys. What do you think?
Yeah, Janine will be able to provide more detail. So some stuff in the blueprint is saying you have to show continuous improvement, but there are some hard benchmarks right in there as well too. So yeah. I think that would add to the conversation. Okay. We were talking about accountability. So now that you mentioned it, so Pillar 5 talks about compliance and accountability. So there are reporting requirements that are happening as we speak, that all the LEAs are doing as well too. So you're going to see that as well. In addition to the additional reporting requirements from the county, there's additional reporting requirements for Blueprint, which we're in the midst of.
Okay. Yep. All right. That good.
And if I may say, so the Office of Finance works closely with Ms. Backey and having that conversation so that we can align the budget with the deadlines that are coming and make sure that we right size, like you mentioned, right? Make sure that we're budgeting appropriately to eventually make sure that we meet the blueprint's requirements.
Yes. And because one other thing I learned yesterday is that the blueprint folks, the Accountability and Implementation Board determined very recently that they should, shockingly, have a member, a Board of Education member from Maryland on the AIB, which they had not had before. And they made the decision and they opened up the applications, but they close within, I think, 5 calendar days, ridiculous amount of time. It makes you wonder how serious they are. But I'm just going to put it out there for any of my colleagues that want to get that application in. It would be great to have one of our board members on the AIB. Yes, interesting that they did not see that as something that was important up till now. And one of the things I also wanted to mention, we have talked about our new superintendents coming on. I am very, he has an MBA. It'd be very interesting for us to work with a superintendent who brings that expertise and looks at things through that lens. But also in that scope, it is also time for the board to take a look at our strategic plan. We tend to do that on a 3-year cycle. We are at the end of our last 3 years, so that this will be something that we will be doing and beginning that work very soon. And it will be important, I think, for us to look at all of this reality when we are looking at our strategic plan goals, because the strategic plan is the direction we want the system to go. But there's so many pieces and parts that this will be an important part of the work for the budget coming forward as we move through looking at what our strategic plan goals are for the system. And I think that is all that I have, but I do want to thank Mr. Riley for pointing out, we do get a substantial chunk of our funding from the state. And in Maryland, all those formulas are per pupil based, and so enrollment drives budget numbers. And so when you are a system like we are, when the state closes the books on enrollment on September 30th and uses that number once it's cleaned up and finalized for the basis of our pure pupil funding allocations for the next academic year. But a school system like ours, when we have so much mobility, and we will have sometimes the equivalent of a full big high school added to that number during the course of an academic year, that does tend to put us behind the 8 ball on that, even on that per pupil funding allocation that comes from the state. So something that we are always trying to be aware of when we are looking at our operating budget. And I sometimes think our funders fail to.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as Ms. Gomez mentioned, we build our staffing based on projected enrollment to avoid that. So because we know we're going to be, in increasing enrollment, we're going to be underfunded because to stay ahead of the curve there.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so moving on, our next agenda item, we are looking at our procurement processes, and something that has come about, I think, since April, or conversations about the need, deep need, for us to have a workflow study analysis, because it is well known that we have bottlenecks in our work, that moving contracts, procurement items, and MOUs forward, and those slowdowns and bottlenecks affect student opportunities. Like if we don't get the MOU signs for our Academy of Health Professions students, they can't move into their clinicals. If we get great grants, but if we can't get through the contract process before those dollars need to be spent, we leave that money on the table. And so this is an issue that we need to fix, and we need to create efficiencies, but we have to start by first understanding very objectively our current workflow and identifying with a very cross-office team where we can create improvements. So I'm very excited about this. Maybe not everybody thinks this is so exciting and sexy, but I think it's great. Anyway, so moving on.
So this discussion fits right into our making every dollar count, because we do want to look at our processes to make them as efficient as we can, see if there's potential cost savings, or just to see if we can make them easier for our stakeholders, our users, the folks within the schools. So in last year's budget, the Office of Procurement moved under the Office of Finance umbrella. And in the spring of last year, we had the Council of Greater City Schools come and do a thorough review of all of our procurement processes. One of the things that they noticed right off the bat, and one of the things that prompted it, was our P-card processes, which we immediately, and we've talked about that in this Fiscal Management Committee meeting, we adjusted some of those thresholds. We looked at ways that we can make that not only more efficient, but more reliable to make sure that we're following our procedures. But another suggestion was to look at our process flow, which, even me being in the system, if I want to, put out for a contract, or I have a need within the office and I need a contract, it wasn't always so user-friendly, and we're working on that. And one of the ways that was suggested was kind of do a flow chart, but we've gone even beyond that. So I'm going to introduce Ms. Angela McIntosh Davis, our procurement director, to go through, and the next slide, please, sorry. To go through the flow chart that we've been looking at of all the different variables or different decision points for the stakeholders within our system when they need a contract.
Good afternoon. So this flow chart was developed by the Division of Procurement. Our contract administrators, who are in the audience, worked on this because this has been evolving probably since COVID timeframe, when we needed some sort of form, some way to start the process and take it through the end user request, coming to procurement, involvement with legal, et cetera. So this flow chart starts with what we call a contract review form, that MCPS form 203-6. That's the form I'm speaking of that evolved.
I'm going to ask a quick question.
Sure.
Can you explain your color coding here?
Oh, I think it's just,
Things are green, some things are green, some things are blue.
It's like green are the forms.
I think you're right.
Okay.
Yes. So, but this was just to establish internally amongst the departments sort of what they were requesting so that they know all of the forms that are required and kind of where it goes from there. So as you can see, if someone's requesting a new contract, which technically means if a requesting office wants to enter into have a service or purchase goods, then they would fill out this form, tell us what it is that they're looking to do, anticipated cost, and the budget office would also see that form, confirm that those funds are in their budget in order to move forward. It comes to procurement. Procurement would look at what the request is and the cost, and then our thresholds and things of that nature come into play, where it determines whether or not a bid or an RFP is required, or if quotes are required, et cetera. So this sort of guides the end user in knowing what we're doing or what the process is and how it would flow. So if it's more of a partnership, so to speak, an MOU may come into place, but we speak with legal practically daily on these forms that come in so that we kind of know which route it will take. And then there's some existing contracts that are already in place that we've been using this process for. And if they want to extend the contract further, which you see those on consent items and when we extend, or if there's an amendment necessary, if there is additional services that they are requesting. I think as an example, one of those was yesterday at the board meeting with the summer program with Jessa. So that's like an amendment to a current contract for additional services. So this is just the process workflow, and this particular workflow is currently being put into a system, like a database, an internal database. And we have IT helping us with that as well, so that it's not so manual, excuse me, with regard to the kind of the communication via email, back and forth sending. It's going to flow through a system. And that's still in process. We hope to have something in the next couple of months. They've been going through some demos. So we're into the details of that right now, of trying to establish this similar workflow, but with which parties within the district, so that everybody knows where this contract is sitting, or what process it's in and where it's moving, so that there's not confusion, or that it's sitting in a folder somewhere or in an electronic folder somewhere, and it can move through the process more efficiently.
So if I may, the process right now is very manual. It's a paper that goes from office to office, and nobody knows really, the office that has the contract or the form knows where the contract is or the bid. So by working through technology, the hope is to establish a workflow process so that you submit a form online through a Google form, and then once that is approved, it flows to the next area. The person initiating the request knows and are able to track, where the process is, and then also allow us to expedite a process so that, so that we know exactly, where the contract is sitting, so that we avoid, we create some efficiencies in this process. We have created efficiencies in the last couple of years, like Ms. McIntosh mentioned. The contract review form has been changed in the past. The offices would submit the contract review form to procurement, and there was no checking where there was budget available for not, for that particular contract. So that has been some of the improvement we've made. Now it has to come through budget. The funding has to be identified, and nothing can move forward until that happens, because we had instances in the past, unfortunately, where a contract has moved forward, and then we had to go back and find out how are we going to pay for it. So those are some of the process improvement that we have been working through over the last few years.
Yeah, as Ms. Alfonso Windsor mentioned, there are numerous points that have to be taken as we go through this process. By automating it, or by kind of having a process where we could track that, we can look and see where those bottlenecks might be. I mean, there are going to be issues where, it's going to take one particular contract or one MOU a little longer to go through. But we will have the ability to then kind of define how much time it does take to get through each of these areas, so we can kind of let our stakeholders know that it's not going to happen tomorrow. It might take a week or two to kind of get through this process to make that contract request available or to the board.
And I can just add as well, once we receive that contract review form, if we determine that an RFP is required based on that threshold, then we need to then work with the department on the statement of work, scope of services, to develop the actual RFP. The RFP stays out on the street for approximately 30 days. Then it has to be evaluated. And then there's kind of establishing if there's a recommendation and approval, when it could actually go to the board for approval before we can even execute the contract. So there's several months typically that is involved in the process from start to executing the contract.
Ms. Harris, if I could jump in just real quickly, sorry, over here. To supplement a couple of comments that were made, one of the things that would be helpful with the workflow process is that that we've talked about is it allows not just for kind of an anticipatory suggestion as to how long things might take, but also would automate how long things actually are taking in the process, so that after a year we can go back through and analyze, what, based on the type of contract that we're talking about or the different points that it needed to touch, how long that could take and whether that does or does not make the most sense. The other thing that I wanted to offer to supplement with is that our office has been in discussion with the Office of General Counsel as well, related to kind of the overall contract management process as it relates to kind of all items that would need to come through for final signature. Most of them flow through this process. Some are, non-dollar agreements or operating agreements that just require signatures kind of across the system. But that I've been in discussion with Stephanie Williams about how, we can work alongside this process to streamline as many of those things as possible. And so would look to implement that discussion with this as well.
Thank you, and that's a good lead-in to the next slide. So what we've been talking about is the RFP process, right? So, we just acknowledge there's a lot of steps within that process, and with those steps, there's a cost to it as well, too. So one of the recommendations from the Council of Greater City Schools was to look at our minimum threshold for RFPs. So we just threw up some comparative numbers. So Maryland State in 2017 went from 25,000 to 50,000. And then just recently in 2023, they increased that from 50 to 100,000. So a lot of the other LEAs in the state model their policies and procedures say that we're going to use our RFP threshold based on what the state does. So a lot of them have followed suit. Some of the larger ones, Baltimore County, Baltimore City, Prince George's, we have stayed at 25,000. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. You might look at that and say, hey, we want to be 25,000 because we want to be as transparent as possible with this process. But in actuality, the 25,000, I see it as a barrier to some smaller companies that really don't have the staffing to put together an RFP. Some of the RFPs we get are 3 or 4 inches thick. The way we can still meet our obligation to get 3 quotes without having to go through that formal RFP process. And I think the fact that we're going to go through this, look at these steps and determine how much time, we can put a dollar sign on that to what it does cost us for an RFP. So if we're not getting any benefit at 25,000, should we move that up? So that's just a point of discussion there and something that the Council of Greater City Schools brought up. The next slide kind of puts a little more numbers on there, but it kind of shows through 1987, we've been at that 25,000 threshold. But in today's dollars, 25,000 equates to 68,715, which is kind of in between a lot of the thresholds for our other neighboring school districts. And then, the bottom line is just what's the purchasing power of 25,000? It really equates to, under $10,000 at this point. So the question is, well, this really requires a good, thorough cost-benefit analysis. Are we putting too much of our resources in this process if we're not getting the bang for the buck, the value for that? So just something on that.
And I just want to reiterate, the procurement thresholds, those are a spending authority. Doesn't mean that that's going to be the cost of the contract. It's just a spending authority up to that point.
A lot of the things we were talking about, it is on the procurement website as well, too. I know we thought it would be beneficial to show that flow chart there. It looks a lot better on a full screen. But we do, all the different processes, all the forms are all linked on the website. So.
No, just appreciate you doing this work and continually looking at our processes, because I've been on this board a long time and they have not improved the way I would have hoped maybe from the beginning. So I appreciate you taking the time to look through these and make things work better.
Ms. Harris, your mic is off, so I'm not sure if she heard you.
Oh, just checking to see if Ms. Yang has any questions since we can't see her. Oh, there she is.
Yes, I have my hands up. So thank you so much. I have a clarification question for Mr. Riley and so spending authority was mentioned, right? So tell me if for example, as a system, we put $5 million as spending authority on paper. I'm just making this up, taking it as an example, okay? So that means we can spend up to $5 million on paper, not necessary that we spend $5 million, but that $5 million will be the placeholder in our budget. So that all the other budget, this become a line item, and that is the number we're using for our budget. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct. And we're tracked. So after the spending authority is granted, then we go through the process of working with vendors to create POs. Part of that tracking mechanism is we want to make sure that anything spent via the PO route and invoicing the normal procurement process does not exceed that spending authority. But you are correct, Ms. Yang, that spending authority is the cap.
Okay. And okay, go ahead.
I do want to clarify. So a lot of times that spending authority could be based on funding sources that we might have not received yet. So if, for example, an item that came to the board, I think this week on the technology, right? We are basing that spending authority on future grants that we might receive. So we might be applying for a grant that we get in January for that, and that grant might have $500,000 for technology, and we get that grant. Having that spending authority allows us to then execute the plan of the grant without having to wait to come back to the board. So it is a budgeted item, but a lot of times we are anticipating future funding sources. You know, it could be from donations, it could be from grants, it could be from PTAs that sometimes donate money to the schools for specific items. So it's not necessarily has to be a specific line in the operating budget. Does that make sense?
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I have a follow-up question. So do we as a system go back and look at these spending authority thresholds? For example, do we ever go back to say, okay, we put $5 million as a placeholder for paper, but how much have we actually spent in the last 3 or 5 years? Do we ever do that?
Yes, and that actually is another recommendation from the Council of Grady City Schools, looking at our spend, doing some spend analysis. Because you make a good point. Just because we've got spending authority from the board does not equate to exactly the amount of dollars that we spend. So spending analysis is different than spending authority.
So do we currently practice that on spending authority lines on our budget? Spending analysis, do we currently practice that?
So we do the financial monitoring every month, and we track everything that we're spending, where our spending is. You know, are we spending more than we anticipated? Are we on track with what we budgeted for? So I think we can go back and do that connection between the spending authority from the board and what we're actually spending. But the offices, as they're requesting this spending authority, because these are requests that are coming to the Division of Procurement from the offices, they are looking to see how much they spent in the past. So for example, going back to that technology item, it was reduced because we knew we were not gonna have ESSER, and that is, you know, and that was money funding sources that we were not gonna be able to have. So we do look at how much we need and what are our needs for the future. Every time that a contract comes in front of the board for a spending authority is because an office has reviewed their needs and what they spent in the past and what they will need to continue spending.
So I brought this up because in tight budget times, right? I really want to look at, you know, if something has been done in the past, that doesn't mean something has to stay the same for the future, right? So one of the items that truly made an impression on me for the consent item during my time on the board, it's a $500,000 allocation, spending authority on file cabinets. I don't know, and I don't think that file cabinets are in high demand. And every schools that we go to will see a lot of surplus file cabinets sitting emptied in classrooms or in offices, right? So that is why I'm wondering if we need to, as a system, to go a little bit deeper in analyzing each item that we budget for. Is that still the number? Maybe that is the number in 1987, but should that still be the number in 2024? I use that might be an extreme example, but you understand that I'm just placing the importance for some of the work you are already doing and would like to see it go deeper. Thank you.
Thank you, and I do want to say, I don't think we have $5 million in our operating budget. I know we don't for file cabinets, even for office supplies, we don't have that much money. That might be
no, it's a 0.5 million, 0.5 million, $500,000,
okay.
Half.
But yes, and that might be, and we can, again, we can look at all of this and we can, because we focus on constant process improvement. I think that is so important. We analyze our processes and know what's working and what's not working. But on that particular item, I might think that it's for new schools, you know, and because they might be needing that money as they, you know, outfit the new schools, but we can definitely look into that. But we will look into everything. I think that is a great point. And as those forms are coming through, the Division of Procurement can ask those questions when the offices submit their requests.
Just to clarify too, because you bring up a good point, Ms. Yang. So 500,000, if that was the spending authority, and let's say we do a review and it was 300,000, and I think that wouldn't be savings because the spending authority really isn't in our approved budget. That's the authority. So, but we do want to make that spending authority consistent with what the actual spend is. But just to for the public, that the authority is not our budget amount and wouldn't present budgeted savings when we do that actual spend.
And I can also add, a lot of our bids that are recurring for a lot of the custodial supplies or things of that nature, every year when we extend, the buyer sends out a request to the requesting department saying, this is coming up for extension, this is how much we took to the board last year, how much are we to take this year, and they are supposed to go back and look at their actual spend to readjust that number. So we do that as well on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
it's a paper. We did do that. I don't have the numbers offhand, but we did reduce the amount of spend in paper as an example. But
Can I just?
we reduced it by $2 million. So through this process, that's how we look at our actual spend compared to the appropriation compared to what's in the budget.
To Ms. Yang's point, sometimes I think that we work so much in silos that I wonder, just utilizing the file cabinets as an example, if we do have a new school, that doesn't necessarily, being built, doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, mean we need all new file cabinets if the school down the street has 3 of them, sitting in storage, or our central office warehouse has them sitting there. I mean, it's nice to get all new things, but I hope that we are doing everything we can to make sure that we are using what we have currently to the best of our abilities.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the question is really about the spending authority, and we're using the file cabinets as an example. Maybe we can get back to you around more information around the process for spending authority, just in the interest of time.
I thought they answered it pretty well.
Yep. So, and just building on, and this is for another meeting, I think, but a big concern that I have that builds onto these kind of questions is that I don't know if we actually have a 21st century functional inventory tracking materials management system. I don't know if at any given time, and we should be able to, our warehouse can tell us exactly how much they have of everything, because I do not think we have that capacity, and that is something for another day, but we are a very large entity, a very large company, and we should have a state-of-the-art inventory control system, and I do not think we do. And I guess my first comment is I'm actually stunned that in 2024, an organization of our size does not have an automated process for entering and tracking and following things like contracts, procurement items, and MOUs. So that's one. I'm glad that we're moving away from that, but I'm shocked that it's 2024 and we're not there.
Paper paychecks.
Yes. Oh my God. Don't get me started.
Time cards, I mean.
Because, and I do, what I want to know though is that this conversation began from multiple conversations with multiple offices, departments, and divisions about problems they were having in an ongoing way with getting things moving through the system, contracts, procurement items, MOUs. So what I'm interested to know is are we taking the actual problems that people are experiencing, the actual, contracts that didn't make it across the finish line so the grants didn't get spent? Are we taking those? Are we actually doing a root cause analysis for each one of those things, back mapping to see where the holdup was, where the bottleneck was, where in whose office and what file did that get stuck in, so that we are fixing the problems that we know exist?
Yeah, Ms. McIntosh Davis did mention that she's been meeting with certain groups to kind of automate this process. But I remember sitting in meetings with stakeholders to look at some of those pain points and look at some of those bottlenecks as well, too, to help drive this process and to help look at best practices.
Yep.
I think a lot of it too is grants, for instance, the time constraints that some of the offices are placed under when they are provided with a grant, or the grant application process is a very short period of time, but the service is going to exceed our threshold. They can't get it done within the time constraints. So that's kind of where the increasing the threshold would still come into play as well, to try to move some things along. So I think we know some of the things we can do to just help these departments get the services they need much faster and still be complying, you know, with the law, so to speak, with regard to these thresholds and what needs to happen. And then there are also like requirements where to apply for a grant, for instance, they have to identify the partner, but they can't identify the partner without going through the process as well. So it's just, it's really a timing issue to some degree. So we're trying to work on that, trying to be notified as early as possible and see what other options are available, like bridging contracts sometimes, in order to work with a particular vendor, et cetera.
Yeah, and I will just say this, as I've said it many times, I was a Fed in 1992 and a big fan of Al Gore's, reinventing government work, and I believe very deeply, every step in a process needs to add value, and if it doesn't, it needs to go. And so I hope that is especially now when every dollar has to count, I hope that is the lens through which we are examining our own processes and not being wedded to things that this is just the way we've done it, but really, really looking very intentionally. Do we need this step? Does it add value? If it doesn't add value, let's get rid of it, because things need to move more quickly through the system, and it really shouldn't take somebody reaching out to a board member repeatedly after going back and forth for 6 months to get their MOU signed. And to jog it out of wherever it was stuck in the system. We should be tracking that stuff, because every piece, every contract, every procurement item, every MOU, at bottom line is an opportunity for a student. And it's how we make the work happen. And so, as efficient as it can be, bottom line is how we are serving students well, how we are serving our employees well, and how we are being fiscally responsible for the dollars that we are provided through taxpayers. So I think really, really a sense of urgency around efficiency is so important, because, the bureaucracy is painful. And I did want to add, I do appreciate Mrs. Madrowski's point about opening up a new school, not just assuming everything that goes into that school has to be bright, shiny, and new. I had, very personal experience moving, as a teacher, moving from the old Edison to the new Edison, when I had perfectly functional items in my skills lab that I wanted to take with me, and I was told, no, you can't, because it's not new. And so we ended up spending money we didn't need to spend, getting equipment that didn't work for us, because you weren't listening to the experts in the room who were doing the work. And I remember having conversations very directly with a series of superintendents about that, and who said they were surprised that was our process that we followed. I'm like, I hope we fix that, because that, again, gets to spending money we don't need to spend for reasons we don't need to spend it. And, I see Ms. Yang's hand again.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a clarifying question for Ms. McIntosh Davis on the spending authority. So when you look at other IEAs, is it a practice, maybe people have different spending threshold for different category? For example, can people separate grant timeline, like for asking for the board permission on one set threshold and the rest on another threshold? Is that a practice, or is that allowed? I'm talking about like the conversation. This is a question in regard our conversation about our thresholds for thresholds that require Board of Education approval. So can you separate the grant from the rest of the competitive bids?
That's a good question. From my understanding, the threshold stands across the board as far as doing business with, getting a service provided. But I think another part of your question might be, could we get or obtain board approval after, like later? Is that what you're asking? I'm just trying to get clarity on what you're...
Because I truly hear what you said about some grants. Yeah, well, I'm looking at efficiency, right? Okay, so you're talking about some grants have very tight schedule for turnaround, right? Then the threshold that require Board of Education approval is right now at 25,000, and that might elongate the process or make it, takes longer, might not, and that may make us discourage the system to apply for some grants or may miss some opportunities, right?
Correct.
So I'm trying to see whether that part, the grant part, can, is it allowed, or are there any coma, are there any regulation, are there anything to say that actually you can have two separate process for those things?
I know that... Go ahead.
So if I may, normally our processes, the funding source doesn't guide the process. So the policy states that the board would, has approval of any contracts or any spending authority over 25,000. So that would require a change to that because our policies and usually our guidelines for anything, positions and all that, it's the funding source doesn't guide the process.
So that is our own internal policy, Board of Education policy on funding process.
That's, yes, correct. That's
So
what the policy states.
okay. So maybe as a board, I'm in consultation with legal, maybe there's something we can look at. Can the grant process be a little bit different?
I'm not sure that it's by source in terms of COMAR versus grant versus state aid versus not. I think, and we do need to double check it, but I do think it's curriculum materials and then everything else, but it's not necessarily grant versus another funding source. But we can check that offline and have a conversation with legal.
Okay, just to close out this section, I mean, we have been talking in this committee for over a year, I believe, about looking at changing our threshold, requiring board approval, moving it from the $25,000 mark where it's been since 1987, and raising that to a threshold that's more consistent with current dollars and what the state's doing and what other LEAs are doing. So are we moving on that, or? We've been talking about it, so.
25,000?
Yeah.
I'm not voting for that.
So we have been talking about that for a while. Are we gonna?
I mean, we our thoughts were we bring it here to discuss the financial aspects, but it would have to go through policy committee.
Okay. Because I think that is a conversation we should have, because, I mean, writ large, it's causing additional work. It's preventing us from using some smaller vendors because of their own, processes. But also, I mean, practically speaking, $25,000, I don't know how many items we actually get that are under the $50,000 threshold. But, I mean, I think it troubles me that this is something that we haven't moved since 1987, because that was a very long time ago. So anyway.
I will just let you know, we have spoken about it at Policy Management Committee, and we decided not to go through, and it does not have any effect on which vendors are awarded contracts, because we asked about that specifically.
Okay, so moving on to our next.
Ms.
Your
Ferris.
mic is off.
Something we've been talking a lot about lately, and that you sort of give a little bit of a runway about earlier. So I will turn it over to you guys. Employee Benefit
Thank
Trust
you.
Funds.
And just before we start on that item, if I can have just one point of clarification. As you know, we've been implementing new financial systems, our new human capital management system. The first system, the financial system, does include the inventory aspect for the warehouse. So we do have an inventory tracking system.
We do, currently.
Yes.
So when people bring those big pallets back from a school, everything has got a code on it, it's, because, okay.
Correct.
I know that wasn't happening like last summer, so, okay.
So now we're going to discuss our employee benefit plan, which is a hot topic. We do know that we are experiencing challenges right now where with the cost, the high increase in claims and the cost of those claims. And it's something that we're going to be looking at. We have been looking at it for the past year. We're going to continue looking at it. We're monitoring it closely. And I know that Mr. Riley is going to go over the plan and what we've been doing to mitigate some of those expenses.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So just a point of clarification, it has been the topic of discussion for the last year or two, but just for the general public, MCPS does maintain, we have a hybrid. We have a self-insured plan, but then we have a fully insured plan as well, too. And in addition to health, the benefits include dental, vision, prescription drug. Employers are given that option during open enrollment, which is once a year, for all these different variations. So one of the key things that we wanted to bring to light was that, just like our operating budget, and we mentioned this before, the employee benefit plan needs to be sustainable. So in other words, the revenue has to exceed the expenses. And just another clarification, so we're saying employees and retirees, so sometimes we'll just refer to it as the EBP plan, but we do have two separate trusts, one for the active employees and one for the retirees. So just that's how we do it. Not everybody does it that way, but that's how we keep those revenue and expenses separate. Next slide. So we were talking about how do we look at the status, in addition to meeting here at Fiscal Management and at the board table, we do put this information in our monthly financial monitoring report as a separate section all on its own. And this is where we're making projections for where we think the fund's going to be at the end of the year. And that's what we do from November through June. We don't do it for July and August. There's just not a lot of activity over the summer. But, we bring it on a monthly basis after that. And we look at the individual components. So in other words, when we talk about the revenue and expenses, there's a few different revenue components in each of these different trusts. One is the local contribution, which is in our category 12, and that's the large part. That's what MCPS pays on behalf of the two funds. The other is retiree or employee contribution. And that's based on negotiated cost share, and that's another revenue. And then we do have rebates as well too. Some specific to retirees, some for both, whether it's for prescription drug or health, we'll get rebates as well too, which forms the basis of our revenue for those funds. The expenses are our claims and our administrative costs. So, next slide. So what happened? So last year or the last 2 years. So each year, as I mentioned, we do rate setting as part of our open enrollment process. So at that time, last year, we worked with our healthcare consultants, and it was determined that 9% would be sufficient to support the rate increase in claims. Unfortunately, what we realized when we talk about looking at actual expenses, it was more like 12%. Some of our neighboring school districts, they were above that even, 12 to 14%. One of the things that helped us there was by doing the RFP for healthcare, we were able to reap some savings there, or I don't know about savings, it's just a reduction in our outflow. But what we saw was because of that increase from 9 to 12, and because due to cost share, the system is bearing the brunt of that cost, we ran into a situation which prompted us to do an expenditure freeze in January. We realized if we didn't do that at the time, we would not have the funds to pay the benefits within these plans. As well, we got additional assistance from the county. They did a $10 million one-time supplemental fund to keep the fund afloat, and they diverted some of the money that They contribute on our behalf for other post-employee benefits, or OPEB. Normally, they allow us to use $27.2 million to cover current year costs. They afforded us another $10 million to do that. So that's what basically got us through this fiscal year. If we do, and then we were able to use some of our fund balance. So we had talked about fund balance that we no longer have a savings plan where we save money or fund balance to use in the budget for the next year, but we do have unassigned fund balance. So last year we had $9 million that came out of the financial report. We used $5 million of that to cover the expenses as well too for the as a supplemental appropriation of our fund balance to support costs within these two funds.
So when you say, could you give the vast listening audience a definition of unassigned fund balance?
So unassigned fund balance is basically our bottom line. Kind of like, as the name describes, this is funds that we can use, or we can go back to the county and say, we want to be able to reappropriate this. We've done this a few times. We did it for curriculum 5 or 6 years ago. We had $4 million that we reappropriated or took as a supplemental. So this year,
So when you say reappropriated, we put it, because we keep saying in our operating budget, every dollar is assigned to something. So when you're saying we reassigned it, that means we'd assigned dollars to something and ended up not needing it for that something, so we had it available to spend on something else?
Yes, so there's two things there. So fund balance, according to Comar, we had to have a positive fund balance. So last year we had $9 million. Just as an aside, that's about what we spend in a day. So we were able to save $9 million. That was part of our unassigned fund balance. The monies that we were talking about, the $25 million that used to be there to support the next year's budget, that's assigned fund balance. Encumbrances are assigned fund balance. But the unassigned fund balance, the bottom line, we are able to utilize that in situations like this where we need it in that current year. We do have to go to the county and ask for a supplemental appropriation to use that. But that's our unassigned fund balance, is what's left after we spend everything at the end of the year, the audited unassigned fund balance.
Because I think some of the terminology is confusing. If it's our money in our budget, but we have to go to the county council and ask for a supplemental appropriation, but they're not really appropriating us anything because it's already in our budget. They've already appropriated it in our operating budget, for that fiscal year. So I think the terminology is confusing.
So if I may, so we base our budget, right, almost a year in advance. We start developing the budget almost a year in advance. And we budget based on what we think we're going to spend, projections, informed projections, but there are projections. Throughout the year, when there are vacancies, we have lapse and turnover where the funding is not spent. So that is what makes up our balance at the end of the year. It could be that we planned for a contract that was going to cost $150,000, but we found some reductions. We negotiated reductions, and it only cost $140,000, so we saved $10,000. So that is what our fund balance is. So at the end of the year, the county, as you know, and the board, the county appropriates our budget by state categories. So that is how we're supposed to spend the money. At the end of the year, anything that was not spent becomes part of our fund balance. MCPS, as opposed to other local agencies under the county council, any fund balance that we have has to remain in MCPS. For other agencies, the county can appropriate the money or reappropriate the money for other agencies. But for us, anything that we have as a fund balance has to be used for MCPS. But when that fund balance now is not assigned to anything specifically, right? It's because we didn't use it during that current fiscal year. So it might be that we had $2 million of that was for lapse and turnover. We have to go to the county council and say, okay, we have this money left, and now we want to use it in this different form. In this case, in the form of employee benefits. So that's why they have to reappropriate it. And as you know, when we submit those supplemental appropriations to the board and the county council, we specify the category now of expenditure where we're going to put that budget. Does that clarify?
Hey, can I just add one more thing on the topic of fund balance? So some folks, if they look at our, because this is the final part of doing our financial monitoring. What is the audited balances? So if you go to page 69 of our annual financial report, you'll see fund balance, and the bottom line is 77 million. So some folks might look at it and said, hey, Rob, you just said we only had 8 million left. What's the 77 million? But it clearly details that 8 million is, we were talking about inventories before, Ms. Harris, 8 million is inventories. The 25 million was for use for the next year budget. So the only available money that we can use in a subsequent year, as Ms. Alfonso Windsor mentioned, was that $8.2 million. So we do not have $77 million of readily available funds. With that, next slide, I'm going to pass it back to Ms. Alfonso Windsor.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the factors impacting our employee benefit plan and what is causing us, this financial challenge. When COVID took place.
Excuse me, I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I did want to let you know, I have another meeting scheduled at 2 and my ride's coming, so I didn't want to think I was being rude stepping out, but I'm going to end up having to go. Sorry.
While we're at that, Ms. Yang also had to leave. She had another commitment. So, Chair, I don't know how you'd like to proceed.
I would love to participate in this conversation if we could reschedule it, but that's just my...
And you're off mic again, sorry.
Thinking about how we could reschedule.
Okay.
Because we won't have a quorum when I leave.
But there's no voting.
We're just in committee. We can work to reschedule to come back to, we have this one and one more. We can do that offline in terms of rescheduling. I think that's what you're asking us to do. Is that right?
You can just go ahead and... I wasn't specifically asking for anything. I was just saying that Lynn will be the only one participating. And if it's possible to reschedule, this was the topic that I was the most interested in and concerned about. So great. If not, it's totally fine, Lynn. I'll watch on TV another time.
So our next scheduled committee meeting is for September 24th. We could take fiscal monitoring up along with the blueprint and technology 5-year timelines and whatever other items we add to the agenda, and or we could look at agenda setting for the next full board meeting.
You could just add an extra hour to the other meeting too.
Yeah. So just thinking and talking, because I think this is very important, and I appreciate the time that's gone into this. I don't have in front of me our proposed, and I do appreciate Ms. Modrowski raising the issue that I think the entire board is actually very interested in this topic. And if it's possible to add this to our agenda for our July 18th board meeting.
We'll take a look at that and let you know. Yeah.
Okay. So I would just say, while we're here, if you would just finish this piece up, and then we will look at, because I do think this is very germane to the board as a whole. And so, I mean, we can just use this as a runway to get it in front of the full board.
Sure. So the factors impacting EBP, once we came out of COVID, we were expecting that expenses would go up substantially. But the year right after, that didn't happen. Things have, as people have been returning back to the doctors and so on, and costs have been increasing and the claims have been increasing since then. We were anticipating that we were going to need more funding in FY23. The board's tentatively adopted budget did include $30 million for EVP, but it never made it, past the county council, county executive, and the budget was reduced at the time. So that's one of the factors impacting our budget. A specialty drug cost, such as, Ozempic and so on, that is impacting the cost of EVP. Increasing cost claims, we have a lot more claims and the average cost is keeping increasing. And as Mr. Riley mentioned before, the rates, we set 9% rate, and when we met again with our actuaries, we realized that the cost in January When we met in January, the cost that they had projected a few months before had increased substantially. So that's when we went from that 9% to that 12 or 13% increase in rates. And then we are seeing, which we hadn't seen in the last couple of years, an increase in number of large claims. And those are claims more than 100,000. We have been informed that the cases of, unfortunately, cancer have gone up, and that is, it's also putting, a financial stress on the employee benefit plan. So we are trying to take actions to mitigate this, the cost and the impact to our EVP. Our financial services and our accounting department have worked very closely to invest our money. And when you see our fund balance this year, it includes $7 million in interest income from our investments that we've made. And we are hoping we're going to propose to move forward a supplemental for $7 million to support the employee benefit plan in FY25. We are making sure that we are reviewing, we're meeting more often with our actuaries and with our vendors to anticipate, so that nothing is a surprise, right? So that we know what is coming. And we are going to make sure that we establish adequate rate increases to make sure that the plan can be supported moving forward. Every month, we do our financial monitoring meetings. Like I mentioned, we're meeting with our vendors and our actuaries. And we started, and I believe it was last month, time is mixing together, but we are starting conversations with our employee associations in terms of the plan design and plan management to see how we can, begin finding solutions for this that impacts every single employee in Montgomery County Public Schools. And we know, health is so important. We know that is one of the most important benefits that we have and one of the things that we use to be able to recruit, highly qualified staff. So we are starting those conversations with our associations, employee associations, and we will continue them, throughout the summer. So part of those plan management and design discussions that we just mentioned, we are bringing them in, and we're hoping to be able to do some things or implement some things earlier rather than later. Some things have to be negotiated, but we're hoping that in collaboration with them, we're able to implement some of the of items that will be beneficial for both our employees and us earlier than anticipated. And then we will have to negotiate part of the plan management and design items such as copays, deductibles, contribution levels. They're all negotiable, and then we're going to have to, work with them to ensure that we meet the needs of MCPS and our employees.
Yeah, and I appreciate you raising that because I think a lot of people, most people, I think, do not understand what it means when we say both we're self-insured and we manage our own fund. So when people have complained about the coverage of Cigna, for example, having to start saying it's not what they offer, it's what we tell them to offer. And those are negotiated. And so it's not like what Cigna decides they're going to include in their insurance coverage plan. We tell them what our needs are. And then when we open these up for these RFPs, the external vendors tell us what it will cost, what they will charge us to provide exactly the services that we tell them we're going to provide. So it's a little bit, I think a lot of people don't understand that, and they don't understand too that we manage our own plan. And so one of the conversations that I think we really need to be clear about when we bring this to the board as a whole is talking about the fact that some of the items that might be, for example, discussed in improving the way our plan is managed is when we look at these glucagon drugs like Ozempic, ensuring that we're not paying for those very expensive drugs unless it's an on-label use. And my understanding is now we have not been. If someone is prescribed it by their physician, we're covering that, whether it's an on-label use or not. And so those are some of the things that I think people need to understand. And also looking at, benchmarking us when it comes to the cost share. Because our cost share is in some ways out of alignment with, for instance, other county agencies, surrounding jurisdictions. And I think it's we do want to be an attractive employer. But when we're looking at a bottom line that we're concerned is going to be in the red, that's not being a good employer. If we can't provide you the coverage that we said we were going to provide you, then we're not doing our job. So I think all of these things need to be on the table and need to be in a very open-minded and objective way discussed. And I know that can be hard. But yes, so those are the things that we're definitely going to want to talk about when we bring this to the board as a whole. And we'll look at the agenda and see when we can do that, because again, this is very germane interest to the board and to our county partners. So are we okay? And I think we did have one other item on the agenda, but I think you sort of covered it, Ms. Alfonso-Windsor.
Yes, we discussed part of our financial monitoring process, and we can discuss that anytime.
Okay, all right. Well, as always, thank you very much for the work and what you're doing to demystify a very complicated and large budget process, and we are adjourned.